Well, welcome to episode 11 of the Wright County Restoration Project podcast. My name is Jamin.
I'm Sam.
And we are here again. Took a week off, but we're back talking about the final amendment within the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment. Very similar in a lot of ways to the 9th in a sense. I guess we might call them brothers in meaning. And I guess we've got a fairly good amount of content today, or at least we might. So let's go ahead and get right to it. Why don't I read it for us today, and then we can talk about it. So the 10th Amendment to the Constitution: the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. So we would perhaps see this as the best expression of the idea of enumerated powers or the limited powers of the federal government.
Absolutely. And like you said, this is the last in that first 10 amendments that were laid out. And you see, I mean, we've said it before, but it's amazing how simple and clearly worded it is. It's not, it's very clear and to the point that whatever is not laid out clearly in the Constitution, enumerated in those things, that is either left to the states or to the citizens. Right. It's, there's not a lot of gray area, at least from the reading of it, that you could find. Though, as we'll kind of talk today, things are a little different, and you're probably wondering after hearing that amendment, well, then what about the government getting involved in, say, agriculture, right, or getting involved in labor things, or regulating that you can do this or that in your business, or that type of thing? And how did that happen, and why? And I think we'll get into some of that today.
Yeah. So we see this concept, and we've talked about it time and again, the fact that the amendments reflect that, which the Declaration of Independence reflected as well, that the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, is intended for people who will morally self-govern. And that is what is anticipated here, is that other than those enumerated powers and mostly in many cases restrictions, the states, and then as it continues to filter down, getting down to the individual citizens, will have the power to govern themselves. And
right,
as we look through some of the ways in which this has been utilized, abused, twisted, confused, I think we're going to see and keep an eye out for this, that exact same trend, that as American citizens have been willing to either cede those rights or have been unwilling to self-govern, we've seen a chipping away, as it were, of the concept to where we find ourselves today. So what should we start? Where should we start as it relates to understanding the nature of this amendment?
Well, I think it would be good to go back and talk about the reasoning, and we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but kind of go into more detail about the actual Constitutional Congress that came together, that put together this document called the Constitution, which was a group of men. Each state sent a delegation, for the most part. A few states didn't, due to various things. And a couple states, their delegations were kind of recalled, or they left, because while the Constitution being created was, from our point of view, a very good thing, it was still something that many of the states felt like they were giving up sovereignty.
Right.
And that sovereignty was very important to them. As we talked about in earlier podcasts, before this, they had the Articles of Confederation. This is what, after the Declaration of Independence was signed, was a loose kind of document holding all these states together, pretty much for the reason of mutual aid in this revolution that was going on. It didn't give the states that much power over each other. Right. Each state kind of had their own commerce, which was an issue, where one state maybe had some sort of trade with other countries, but the other states didn't, and there was a lot of gray area there, and so a lot of what spurred on the idea that we need a constitution, we need a stronger central government, not necessarily to the extent we have today, but they needed some sort of central government so that there could be a consensus. There could be a government that would protect in times of war and against danger, and also to help regulate trade internationally and to work out disputes and differences between the states, and so that there would be, you think about it in the Revolution. If you look back, I think it was Benjamin Franklin that put together kind of a political symbol of the time, where it showed a snake in a bunch of different pieces, and it said, if we don't unite, we're going to die. That idea during the Revolution, and that was something that was carried on through, that all these little states, you're just going to wind up with weak little provinces together unless we all pull together and cede some of our sovereignty to a federal government system. But in the case of at least the initial Constitution, the laying out of all this, it was definitely a fairly weak federal system, and the states were very strong in that, which we can see has a lot of benefits.
Go ahead.
So it's interesting. James Madison being the kind of one of the initial people that spearheaded that Constitutional Convention. He was very much for the states having their own rights as well, and this was something that was debated hotly on the floor of the Constitutional Convention. It was something that was probably, I'd have to look it up, but from what I've seen, it seems like that was probably one of the had the greatest amount of debate on it, was how much of state sovereignty are we going to have to give up? It's interesting now, we don't think about that as much. We, people from Texas are Texans, and we see it a little bit in our Virginia. Virginia kind of has that, we're Virginians first and then Americans second. But other than that, it's hard for us to kind of wrap our head around this state sovereignty, state comes first and then national government comes second idea. It's something we don't see very much, but it was something that was really almost the opposite, where everyone had their state was very important to them, and ceding any of that power away was very repulsive to many of those people.
Yeah, and as we look back into history, the initial intent of everyone knew that the Articles of Confederation were not sufficient.
Yes.
But when they began to gather, it was to revise the Articles of Confederation to perhaps make things a little clearer, figure out how to deal with states to states, but certainly not, the initial vision was not for a constitution like we ended up seeing, and that's where the Federalist Papers came in, and the intent of justifying a stronger federal government through those Federalist Papers and through a pretty significant process of trying to bring everybody to a point of measured consensus as it relates to this, whatever degree it was, that they were going to have to cede some measure of sovereignty to a larger deliberative body.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of this is bore out in the Federalist Papers. We see in the Federalist number 45 from James Madison. Here, I'll just read what he says there. And this is kind of to enumerate on this topic of federal government versus state government. He says this: the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally in essential objects on essential objects such as war, peace negotiation, and foreign commerce. So it's a very narrow amount of power that was given to the federal government. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvements, and prosperity of the state.
So it was very, very narrow, and we'll see that even as it would progress in near history following the
Yes.
Constitution, that there would immediately be some interesting modifications and such to the thinking on that, or to how the government would grow. And in many ways, I believe that would be the underlying foresight of many of these states, that they perhaps recognize the necessity of a measure of federalism while simultaneously seeing the writing on the wall, that anytime you allow for a top central power, perhaps even many of them thinking back to the nature of the church-state systems that many of them or their parents or grandparents had come out of, and seeing how a top-heavy sort of a system, or even just allowing for a top, means that top is going to grow and grow and grow, and then eventually become top-heavy,
Right.
as we've seen it today.
Absolutely, and that was something that once the Constitution was signed at the Constitutional Convention, it didn't become the law of the land until it was ratified by each of the states, and each of those states, and that's where we actually see these first 10 amendments come in, and where they are brought forward, and a lot of states basically dug in their heels and said, without this Bill of Rights, as we put it, these 10 amendments, we're not going to touch this Constitution, because they really wanted to make sure that this was a safeguard for the states and for the citizenry. And like you said, the people definitely had not so distant memory of the excesses and abuses of a very top-heavy system. And it is interesting that as we continue on, it's about 150 years till these things start getting eroded away, and the federal government starts really reaching itself into places where it really was, at least according to the founders, never really meant to be. So that's what we kind of see. We see in after that convention that there are actually 25. This was something interesting that I found, that there was about 25 amendments that were proposed, and then 12 were kind of batted around, and finally about 10. About 10 of them were passed, and that's the 10 we have, and those were kind of cemented when Virginia voted for ratification. Virginia was pretty much the most powerful. Virginia and Massachusetts kind of guided things at that time and had the most sway in the 13 states, but it was, definitely every state did have a say, but there were a few that really kind of shaped things, and when Virginia kind of went for those 10 eventually became what we know as our 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights.
Okay. Well, what else?
So, like I was saying, let's fast forward a little bit into history. About 150 years later or so, and I don't want to pick on any particular political person per se, but we do see, and we can kind of see different presidents and their administrations that started to erode these things away. And it's interesting that it wasn't necessarily, it's easy to point the finger at them, but it was obviously that the people definitely turned to the government for help in a time of need. This particular time of need, and we're not going to be, in detail of every time these rights were, given away, because that would be a very long time. But we're going to kind of focus on, at least here at the start, with what what really happened after the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a very hard time financially and economically for the nation around the time of the 30s. And it was actually the last in kind of a series of kind of economic busts that had happened. And what really happens is the people turn to the government for help. And at that time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the president, and he brings forth the New Deal, and that not going to go into a ton of detail of what all that meant, but there was a lot of things that the government stepped in and took control of in an effort, whether good or bad, to help bring about some economic recovery. Looking at it now, not a lot of it really worked all that well, but it's interesting that at this point, and we really see it coincide with the secularization of our country, that people did no longer look to their community for help, and people didn't look to the church for help. They were looking to the government for help, but when the government helps, it is usually very happy to help, but it also comes with strings attached. It comes with control. And that's where we see this, at least one of the big steps in the eroding of when we see the 10th Amendment saying, well, the Constitution doesn't give the federal government the right to dictate these things. Well, if you're gonna ask the federal government for help, they're gonna come in and help for sure, but in their way, and they're not usually going to leave that area of government alone again. They're gonna be in control of that, and it's very easy to give up that control. It's very difficult to take it back.
Yeah, and wise man once said, "Wars are the catalyst of history." And it's not that wars always fundamentally change the nature of a society, but they definitely have a way of taking what is already underlying in society and accelerating it or accentuating it. And of course, we see this time period between World War I and World War II. They are called the World Wars, and this unique time in history when the United States finally, really, after the laissez-faire policy of the last many decades and 150 years before that, decided that they were going to step into the world onto the world stage as a means of defending democracy abroad, and that being particularly against the axis of evil, as it was called, and in World War I, and the nature of that war, the devastating nature of that war. We know, of course, it was particularly devastating to Europe, who never recovered culturally from World War I, much less World War II. And a whole generation of Britons were destroyed, and it was a very consequential time in our history. And when the United States, though they tried in World War II to take the same policy of staying out of it until Pearl Harbor, while we see those attempts, really once the United States got onto the world scene, it seemed as though a top-heavy system was almost inevitable. At which point you have to take on a mindset of defending democracy on a world stage. You must have a strong federal system, a strong united military, standing army. And you must have a strong United States, really, to be able to take that on, and it would accompany a mindset shift in the United States citizenry, where they feel as though there are tremendous threats abroad and threats to their livelihood. At which point, as history dictates, citizens are quite usually more than willing, when their comfort, freedom is seemingly under threat, or lives are under threat, to cede liberty in order to try security. Try to gain security.
Absolutely, and it's interesting. When a lot of, especially as we're talking about how these powers were given away. The government really found its niche, or a bit of a
Loophole, as it will.
loophole or gap in the armor of the Constitution through 3 clauses. And we find those clauses in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. And in there, they've kind of framed 3 different places where they've taken one little sentence and kind of broadened it out into something far bigger. And those, kind of historically, we see those as these 3 clauses: the Commerce Clause, the Taxing and Spending Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause. And so those have really become, and with that, the commerce being interstate commerce or those kind of things, has been really at the forefront, and they have used those things, those clauses, to really get into places where you kind of scratch your head and go, why is the federal government sticking its tentacles of power into this particular place? One of the first, or one case I'd like to highlight, and this happens kind of right in that World War II FDR time frame, is in 1942. There's a case of Wickard versus Filburn, and this is something that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Congress could regulate wheat production on a family farm that was intended for use strictly on that farm. So we're talking about small farm, smaller bag. I don't know the history on that part, but a farmer who wanted to keep all the produce that he created on the farm, which should be technically his right, or at least that would be kind of the way most people would think. But obviously this kind of came into question. Here's kind of some of the reasoning on it. So they were going to use all the wheat on this farm for personal consumption or animal fodder. The court's reasoning was that Congress mandated production quotas on wheat farmers to regulate the price and keep it steady. It did this under the authority of the Commerce Clause, which gave it permission to regulate interstate trade. Of course, a lot of wheat crosses state lines. If an individual would produce a substantial amount of wheat on his own farm and use it for himself, he would not be buying wheat on the market for his own use or selling the wheat that he grew on the market. Both of these things would affect the price of wheat on the market. Therefore, Congress had the authority to regulate it. So, like it or not, that was how the government kind of got into the agriculture business in at least at one step, and it was this wasn't wasn't the first, but it definitely wasn't the last of the government taking this little Commerce Clause or some of these other clauses and working their way into the everyday life of people and regulating things that, at least in the previous many years of the Constitution, really hadn't been under the federal government in any way.
Yeah, and it's worth talking about why this happened. FDR was the president from 1933 to 1945. He was elected numerous times. This was before there were term limits on president of the United States. In fact, it was because of FDR, and he died in 1945.
Yes.
It was because of FDR that term limits were put in place. He was
Right.
an extremely progressive president. He socialized the country. He changed the country. And one of the major ways, we talk about this piece of jurisprudence in 1942. In 1937, throughout the time, 1933 to 37, FDR was making a number of attempts at law that were extremely progressive and very much pushing the boundaries of the Constitution of the United States. And the Supreme Court kept rebuffing his attempts. By 5-4 decisions on that 9-person Supreme Court, they kept saying that his attempts at these various executive acts and such, and these various interpretations were unconstitutional. So FDR proposed he threatened the court to what we call now pack the court. And he wanted to take that nine-person court and turn it into a 15-person court, thus making sure that he would never lose a court case again, as he would be able to appoint a full 6 more justices to the Supreme Court. And this is when, in 1937, there was this thing called, that has been coined, at least in popular culture, the switch in time that saved 9. And basically what happened is Associate Justice Owen Roberts, in 1937, who had been siding with the fact that FDR's desires were unconstitutional, magically changed his opinion on all of these cases and began ruling in favor of FDR on all of these things in order to save the integrity of the court, the integrity of the 9-person court. And so there was this switch that happened, and after that, FDR had a tremendous amount of latitude in his process and in his government's process because of the nature of this threat, as it were, to pack the court, not unlike what has been bantered, at least recently, as it relates to the Supreme Court, the idea of packing the court specifically in order to get an ideological push through, and of course, we'll see what ends up happening with that. But as we look at these fundamental changes to the Constitution, it really began there in many ways, not necessarily just with the 1937 switch in time, but with FDR and the way that he approached the Supreme Court in order to strong arm them into giving him what he wants, really.
Absolutely. And he saw that, like you were saying, he had these progressive ideas, and his only hurdle was the Supreme Court, and thus he kind of worked his way in to get rid of that hurdle versus saying maybe what I'm trying to do isn't constitutional.
You would think, right? Maybe you should just back off a little bit, but that was not FDR's style.
Right.
And that being said, many of our listeners might have grown up in school or reading history books that really see FDR as one of the greater presidents in the United States. And if you look into history, if you have any sort of a conservative viewpoint on our Constitution, any originalist sentiment, you must admit that FDR was a disaster as a president, who not only extended, many economists would say today that he extended the Great Depression by many years because of the policies of the New Deal, but who really turned our country down the path of socialism that now today we are up to our eyeballs in.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting, but like you said, FDR was praised for much of what he did, and definitely stepping in a time of great dire straits in our country, great unemployment, many other things. But when one looks at the history, definitely many of the things that he passed and pushed and regulations that came in definitely did extend that Great Depression timing, and that was, it's interesting, and not everyone was for FDR either. It's interesting. I remember asking my grandpa, who was a farmer out in western Minnesota, and he lived during that time, and he remembers when FDR passed away, and he was driving tractor in the field, and somebody pulled off on the side of the road and waved him down, and the guy who was he said, "Hey, on the radio, FDR just passed away," and my grandpa's response, not being a fan of FDR, was, "Well, I guess he can't run for a 4th term," which very, very much shocked the guy who gave him the news, who was obviously was much more pro FDR. But it's interesting that there was definitely mixed feelings, but FDR did fundamentally change the system and really paved the way. Of course, we see various other presidents throughout history that definitely shifted things as well. But FDR, in more recent times, we kind of see that as where things really go into high gear,
right,
as far as this starts going. And then we see things change under Lyndon B. Johnson and other things
Woodrow
that
Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson, which is even before that. That's the start of World War I, and just really in this past century has really sped things up, and where yes, there are things where the federal government is into that we would never have imagined when you look at the original Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Well, is there anything else on your end to talk through?
Well, I think it's interesting. There has been some back and forth, for sure. There hasn't. It's not all is lost necessarily. People have brought up the 10th Amendment, and there is still something left there to stop things. Interestingly, in a case that there was a case in 1997 that was brought to the Supreme Court. It was a case called Prince versus United States, and in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress could not force a state to conduct criminal background checks on gun purchasers. This would have forced the states to use its own resources to accomplish the federal mandate, and this was also barred by the 10th Amendment. So there's various cases where the 10th Amendment still stands and still is in a sense holding the line versus to hold off the expansion of the federal government. But it is interesting to note, and I think a good takeaway from all of this, and it is easy to get down about the state of things and how much has been given up over this time. But it's interesting to remember, and even when you talk to people in politics today, how important it is for people to stand up and to let their voice be heard. We live in a country where we have the freedom to do that, and to really call out and to make it known that you wish to have government put the brakes on some of these things. Many of these times weren't, the government, there were definitely progressive people in power that pushed progressive ideas, but at least in the case with FDR, there were many people that welcomed this government growth with open arms because of a time of distress in the country. And as we've seen in the past year and the past months, similar things have happened where people have looked to the government, looked to government agencies, government power, federal and state, to try to fix an issue that, as we're looking at it now, and I'm sure it will bear out in history, maybe they weren't the best ones to handle it, or and that is definitely the case when you look at history. So I think that's one thing that sticks out to me is when there are troubles, really the last place that one should look to is the federal government for help in these situations, though that has become almost the go-to. The knee-jerk reaction, the demand that you've got to fix this. There is a whatever crisis that the federal government needs to step in and fix it, when the federal government technically really shouldn't be involved in a bunch of these things. And it is a good thing to remember that whenever government, whether it's local or state or federal government, gets involved in anything, there is an element of control that is inserted that is very rarely, if ever, given up.
Yeah, and this is where we need to, again, exhort a reimagination or a shift in mindset as it relates to our listeners, and hopefully one that you can pass along to your children or grandchildren and to those which you speak with. Whenever the knee-jerk reaction to a problem is, what is the government doing about it? There's already a problem in our mindset. The mindset needs to be, the government needs to stay out of it unless there's a reason for the government to be in it. And the question is going to be, what are we going to do about it? And when we think about things on that level, of course, nobody likes that from the idea of personal accountability, that if I'm making the decision, then there's no one to blame but me. But we need to start getting back to a little of that mindset in our society where the buck stops with us, where if I'm going to be free, then I'm accountable for my actions, I'm accountable for my decisions, and I need to be just as willing to take responsibility for my actions as I am desirous to keep other people's hands out of my decision-making process. And this is something that comes back to a very fundamental part of a person's worldview. Am I going to seek to others to fix my problems, or am I going to seek to my God and to my community, myself and my community, to fix the problem? And a part of it is rooted in the nature of a biblical mindset. The idea of liberty is one that has developed over time, going through Greek thought and Roman thought, Jewish thought in a sense, but then really culminated in Christian thought. And whether you want to talk about some of the older Christian thinkers, Aquinas, or certainly getting into Reformation territory and the thinking surrounding the Reformation, liberty is something that was so precious because an understanding of liberty. When I talk to my people in church about the nature of certain things such as love or forgiveness, I tell them this, and this is true, that a person cannot truly understand love if they have not accepted Christ as their Savior and recognized the reality of the love of God for them, because it is in that fullest expression of love through the finished work of Jesus Christ that we actually understand love.
Yes.
Jesus did not come. When the Bible talks about Jesus as the Word of God, the idea actually does roll back to a Greek concept, the logos, the idea of the fullest expression of something, logos meaning the spoken word. And the idea of Jesus as the Word of God, Hebrews talks about Jesus as the express image of the Father. And so when Jesus loved us, the way in which Jesus loved us, which was to shed his blood on the cross, is the fullest expression of love. The way that Jesus purchased our forgiveness on the cross so that God has separated us from our sin as far as the east is from the west, that concept of forgiveness is the fullest expression of forgiveness. And as it comes to liberty, listener, the concept of liberty is only fully understood in the concept of Jesus Christ's death on the cross and the breaking of the bonds, the bondage of sin and of shame and of guilt and of condemnation found through our incapacity to do right on our own, our incapacity to be right from the inside out. Whereas we might do moral things, we are in our hearts still depraved to the core. And as we think through this reality that we are sinful, and that our sin has separated us from God, and that we are in the bondage to this sin nature, which we were born with, and which we cannot overcome on our own, no matter how much we discipline or work our way out. We see in Jesus Christ a full release from that bondage, that as a person places their full faith and trust in the reality that Jesus died on the cross, that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day in victory over sin, and that he offers a free gift to whosoever will to receive that by grace through faith in that finished work. It is within that mindset that a person truly recognizes the nature and the power of liberty.
Absolutely.
And it is within that context of liberty that a person recognizes that there is nothing in heaven or earth that is worth giving that liberty up for, because they remember the bondage within which they once operated. Now, Americans don't remember that bondage, and most Americans don't understand that in a salvific or in a biblical sense either. And yet, when we think through this concept of liberty and of security and a mindset shift, the mindset shift is this one that says, I have this liberty, and this liberty frees me both to make, both to be prosperous as well as to make mistakes and to fail and to become utterly destitute. But the power is in my liberty to do either. That I'm not being artificially held under the bondage of something else, to be restrained from the capacity to flourish.
Yes.
And then, as Paul would say in Galatians 5, as he was speaking toward the liberty that we have in Jesus, he says, "For brethren, ye have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty as an occasion to the flesh," which would be our sin nature in the context, "but by love serve one another."
Yeah.
And so then we take this concept of liberty, and it compels us unto responsibility,
Yes.
rather than to libertinism or to that idea of anarchy.
Right.
And this mindset shift is essential, that we start to recognize the nature of liberty itself. And if you've not recognized that through the finished work of Jesus Christ, may I encourage you, get a hold of me, send me an email,
Yes.
communicate, contact us, and I would be more than happy to talk to you more about this, to point you in the direction of some resources that can help you understand the fullest extent and nature of liberty, found not liberty in the political sense, liberty in a much deeper, much fuller, much more real sense, through the breaking of the bondage of our sin, and then the securing of a home in heaven when we die. And it's really not until one understands that concept that one can truly understand the value and the importance of liberty. But even today, as we look at history, there are many who are regarding the nature of liberty and the recognition that with liberty comes responsibility and accountability, but that's far better than the converse, far better than bondage for the sake of security and for the sake of restraining some measure of fear of the unknowns.
Absolutely. Well said. And I think, this, what you were talking about in the spiritual realm and in the political realm is it's very interesting in that both of them are an individual choice.
Right.
That, like we've talked about here, that giving up of liberty can be an individual choice, or the taking, or the acknowledging that I have a responsibility in this government. Interestingly, when you start out reading the Constitution, it's "we the people of the United States,"
Yep.
in order to form a more perfect union, and it goes on and lays out the Constitution. But it was talking about we the people. The people were the top
Right.
of that government, which is a very interesting thing. And just as in that, the salvation and as you so eloquently put it, is a personal choice.
Yes.
It's not something that parents or your church or any larger body or group of people can make that choice for you.
Right.
It's a personal choice between you and the Lord. And so those are two very similar things.
They are.
In that the place to start is to, number one, make your make that choice in following the Lord through salvation in his Christ's finished work on the cross, and then taking that personal responsibility in a government sense. Yep. of being a citizen that, as you put, has that power through Christ to do right, and that we can take that responsibility and in a sense be that we the people. Right. and to be governed in a righteous way. And that was something that the founders were very adamant about. Yep. That these documents and that this government system would not function for very long with a godless and secular society.
Yeah, very good. Well, we're right about on time. I thought we went a little long, but we're doing okay here. Any final thoughts on the 10th Amendment or on the Bill of Rights for that matter?
Well, I think it's interesting. It was I appreciated the chance to go through it. I think it's very good to look back at these documents, and I would encourage you to go back and read through them, think about them, research, and study these things. There has been a large amount of time between the ratification of the Constitution and these rights. And there has been much precedent in courts of law and other places that have fleshed out what these mean. And I think one of the most interesting things is to go back and see what the founders that put these in place actually said about them.
Right.
And that's a very key thing to look at when trying to understand what they meant, because especially in these rights, they're very simply and worded and short. And I think it's good to go back. It's good to look at these things and to remember what these rights actually are, and then take those steps, like we said, to remember that the weight of government really rests upon the shoulders of we the people.
Very well said. Okay, well that's it for our Bill of Rights and the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States. Next week we will be moving on to other pastures, and I hope that you have learned and enjoyed from this. I know I've learned a lot, and we've really just scratched the surface of what's been written and thought and all of the jurisprudence and Supreme Court cases and such. Certainly many other places that we could go. But as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, concerns, interesting things to add, we encourage you to pass those along to us at WCRP@LegacyBaptistChurch.net. That's Wright County Restoration Project, WCRP@LegacyBaptistChurch.net. And we would love to hear from you. Like, subscribe. And to this point, I've made the comment section on YouTube closed, but I think that maybe we'll open that up, and that way people can start leaving comments and keep it civil. But we'll open that up and see if maybe we can start engaging the community in a new way as we move forward here. Thank you for joining us again. We'll look forward to talking to you next time on the Wright County Restoration Project podcast.